Hey guys, Miss Vinian here on our last video for the Gilded Age Industrial America. If you look here, you're going to have a test next time I see you, so the next time you're in class, and it will be a writing test over all of these learning targets. You will have to give me examples for each one of these, so you want to make sure that you study that along with this video. Today we're going to briefly cover the movement of people from rural to urban areas due to industrialization. Okay, and we're going to talk about railroads first. So first thing with the railroads is that during this time, right after the Civil War, the railroads kind of rose up. If you remember from Ranger Lewis's picture, they tripled over the time it took to end the Civil War. So rapid construction accelerated the nation's industrialization and linked the country together. At this time, this is where they're going to build the Transcontinental Railroad, and they're going to have to repair the South because the South has been basically torn apart from the Civil War. The other thing that this does is increase markets for many products. And how does that help? What does that mean, you say? That means that we're now able to ship products from one side of the country to the other. So that would be an effect of the railroads. So you have new organizations, one being the American Railway Association, that will regulate railroads. Because at the time, the whole country was on one time zone. Okay, so this is before time zones that we have now, Central and Mountain and Eastern time zone. Before, they did not have these standardized time zones. So what would happen is there would be scheduling errors because time would be different from one city to the next city. And so the American Railway Association would help regulate time zones so that there would not be scheduling errors and also crashes. Okay. So, this leads us to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Alright, this is completed within 4 years, and a Transcontinental Railroad is going to basically connect the country and make it easy for you to travel from the east to the west and from the west to the east. Most of this was built during the Civil War, and it was also built mainly in the north, which the north saw as an advantage for them to have a transcontinental railroad in the north. There will be other transcontinental railroads that were built in the south and even further up north, but this is the first one, and I'll show you a map of what that looks like. There are 400 rails for each mile, and each rail took 10 spikes. Okay, so how are they going to get workers? Where are they going to get these workers from? Many of these workers were immigrant workers, and they came over. A lot of them came from Asia. There was many immigrants from Ireland that came over, so we had mainly the Irish, the Chinese, and the Japanese that came over. There's two specific railroads, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. So this is the Pacific Railway Act, where Abraham Lincoln basically offered land to two different companies. He gave both of these companies land and in exchange for them building this transcontinental railroad. On the Union Pacific, many of them were immigrants, ex-convicts, farmers, cooks, basically anybody who couldn't find a job. Okay, there's Civil War vets. This was a terrible, terrible job because if you were doing the railroads or making the railroads in the mountains, you had to deal with blizzards, and if you were in the desert, you had to deal with heat, and the most dangerous thing you had to deal with was angry Native Americans because this is America pushing the frontier out to the west. Okay, so that was some of the main problems. Make sure that you wrote those down. Those, again, were weather, blizzards in the mountains, heat in the desert, angry Native Americans. Okay, and there's about 10,000 workers that worked on the Union Pacific, same as Central Pacific. So the Central Pacific actually brought laborers from China, and they paid those laborers $1 a day. So it was very good deal for immigrants. This they got their equipment shipped from the east, and this would start pretty much this rise of nativism against Chinese and what we talked about on our last video, the Chinese Exclusion Act, because there's so many Chinese workers that are coming, and Native Americans feel like that they're taking their jobs from them. And so that's going to lead to the Chinese Exclusion Act later on. Life on the railroad was not fun. It was very difficult, and many people died. On May 10th, 1869, so 4 years later, the two railroads meet, and they meet in Promontory Point, Utah. And so they have this big ceremony where the railroads were connected. Okay, so you can see here, this is obviously in the north. Here's what the railroads look like at the time, and so they want to connect these two. So this would be the Central Pacific blue, and then Union Pacific in red. Okay, here's an excerpt from the actual Promontory Point. The trains pulled up facing each other, each crowded with workmen. The officers and invited guests formed on each side of the track. Prayer was offered, a number of spikes were driven in the two adjoining rails, and thus the two roads were welded into one great trunk line from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Okay, so that is a primary source from somebody who was there. So what are the impacts of the railroads? That's really what we're trying to get out here. The benefits are that it's going to stimulate growth, because if you look at this map here, you're now able to ship what was being produced in the north, in the south to the south to the north, east to the west. And this is also going to help cities grow. This is also going to help westward expansion of America. So before we actually got started with this unit, in 8th grade you should have covered the Oregon Trail, and so how people would travel from wagon over to the west. Now it's going to be easier because they can travel on the railroad. And standard time zones were created to get everyone on correct time. What is the problem here? The problem, actually, before I go on, I want to point out this picture down here. It shows you the different time zones. We have Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific time. So the problems in the railroad is that there's lots of corruption. Okay, so what type of corruption are we talking about? We're talking about many of the railroads, specifically the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. Since they built these railroads, they pretty much owned them. They charge much higher rates to Western farmers. Okay, they charge whatever kind of rates they wanted. If you were a farmer in the West, you got charged higher rates than the farmers in the East, which would obviously be unfair. So that also, we had the Union Pacific, which was the one who connected from here to here. And they had what we call the Credit Mobilier scandal. So they formed a company called Credit Mobilier, and then they hired themselves. So Union Pacific created a company called Credit Mobilier. They then hired themselves to build the railroads at inflated prices. And because of that, they were able to earn a lot of money. This is basically fraud. Remember, we talked about Boss Tweed, and maybe the Brooklyn Bridge would cost $40,000, but he would budget $80,000 and pocket the rest. That's pretty much what they were doing. This is a fake construction company. A lot of members of Congress knew what was going on, and Union Pacific was able to bribe them. So when you think about the Gilded Age, you need to think about all of this corruption. This kind of stuff would not happen today. Or if it does, I guess we don't know about it. But there's laws against this kind of stuff. And so what you can see is you have this big octopus here, and who do we have here in the middle? Okay, it was the Railroad King, and they basically, the octopus has all of the merchants and the farmers by the necks, okay, because they can do whatever they please. They can charge whatever they want. And lastly, your learning target discussed why do people move from rural areas to urban areas, and that's pretty much common sense. We know this industrial era is when it's the rise of the factories and people moving to the cities to get jobs. So especially after the Civil War, with all this new, we have steel and coal and iron and all these things that need to be taken care of. There's a lot of jobs. So people are moving to the cities, and immigrants are also stopping in the city. So if you remember last time we talked about, they would have to go through the access points, and then they didn't usually make it out of the city. Many of the immigrants came over wanting to go west, but they could not make it further than the East Coast. So what are some problems in the city? There's housing shortages, and not to mention there's overcrowded apartment buildings, and there's really no standards for sanitation. There's no bathrooms, really. Basically, you went to the bathroom in a bucket and it would dump it out in the street, and it was just pretty disgusting. Transportation, there really was no transportation. And clean water, obviously there's no clean water. It was difficult to produce, and it's difficult to transport into these really overcrowded areas. There's no waste and garbage removal, and if there was, it was very rare, and a lot of people would just dump their garbage in the street. There's also really no standards or codes for these overcrowded living spaces, and there's many fires. So one specific one would be the Great Chicago Fire in 1871. So, and lastly, with the rise of urbanization people coming to the urban areas, crime is going to rise because there's going to be overcrowded areas and there's going to be poverty. And we talked about on our last video how this urbanization will lead to the white flight. So that is people moving out, the wealthier people moving out of the cities and moving into suburbs. Okay, so don't forget that you have a test next class period, and you're going to have to give me examples on the learning target sheet. It's going to be a writing test with a couple multiple choice questions. So we'll review at the beginning of the period, but make sure that you have all this stuff ready to go and your notes with you so that you can review. All right, see you guys later.